Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not exactly how you would expect from our title. I am Clayton Becker.
I'm Megan Cox.
And today we have brought you a very special guest to perhaps offer a bit of levity in these difficult times we are all experiencing right now. And that is our good friend, Cormac Schambach. Cormac is a writer, director. He works in various roles in the film and television industry. And we've brought him here today to talk a little bit about film and television. But before we get into all that, Cormac, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Take it away. What do you do in this business? And I guess also, have you done anything that we would have heard of?
Oh my God. Have I done anything you would have heard of? Maybe. I've worked on a lot of different things. I bill myself as like a writer, director, and first AD. But I've also worked in a smattering of roles between at the lowest of the totem pole as a PA to actual roles like grip, and I've operated pretty heavy equipment. I've driven the trucks. It's kind of easier to say what I haven't done. I just, I'm working, I'm surviving. I've worked on a lot of commercials you probably have seen, and I've also, outside of the set, written a good amount of coverage. Coverage is basically like book reports for the people to figure out what movies we're actually going to make or not.
Got it. Okay.
And some of those ended up getting made that I can talk about. Those would be like three examples would be The Decameron, which is a series on Netflix.
Loved that.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it. I remember that was like easily one of my favorite pilots I've ever got to read. It's a great pilot.
Hysterical. It was so good.
Dream Scenario, which is a A24 film, as well as Maxine, which is the third installment in the X trilogy.
So you're part of the problem.
Part of the problem. I just read it, and basically I get the script, and whoever's above me is like, hey,
somebody else makes the choice.
Break it down. I give a page or two breakdown, and then some other stuff with it. And
I guess to contextualize a little bit why Cormac is part of the problem here is we haven't brought Cormac here just because we like him and just because we want to talk about films a little bit. We've brought him here to do maybe our most real reject modernity, embrace tradition in the sense you might expect from the title episode yet. And that's going to be rejecting sequels and embracing original storytelling. Megan and I were thinking up this months ago, basically, of man, everything we've seen this year practically has been a sequel of some sort, or at least
an extended universe, or a remake, or something.
It's been some adaptation of an existing property, some existing IP, right? And we couldn't think of anyone that we knew who was better to talk about that than Cormac. But Cormac, before we ask you a bunch of questions about how film and TV works and how we can get away from this perpetual sequel cycle we're in, I thought it could be interesting for all of us to go around and say what our favorite film we saw in 2024 was, just before we begin anything. I can go ahead and start because I thought a little bit about this when I was bringing this up for myself. I wouldn't say that it's the best movie I saw in 2024, but the most fun I had at the movie theaters in 2024 was watching Challengers. I thought that was so much fun, and I really, really enjoyed it. Especially the whole Ratman Summer thing that it pushed out. I thought it was really, really fun.
I can go next. I actually, again, part of the problem here. Twisters 2 was my favorite. And I really, when I saw this question in our prep work, I kind of thought, do I want to say Conclave? Because that's the best movie I saw this year. But the one I enjoyed the most was genuinely the second installment, air quotes, in Twisters. And I am ready to defend that because I think that Twisters is a film that only used the sequel concept or nostalgia for marketing, and it actually did almost nothing for the story. There is almost no overlap between the characters and the plot, etc., of the original 1990s Twister and the new film. So it was just for marketing, and then didn't have any of the negative implications of a sequel on its storytelling, which we can talk about later.
We can talk about.
That's why I'm not wrong.
Okay.
Cormac, I imagine you watch maybe more movies than Megan and I do, so it might be harder. What would you say is your favorite thing you saw in 2024?
In 2024, it's really hard for me to remember like what came out in 2024.
Well, for sure, I had to go look at a list.
Yeah, I think, man, I've also been doing a lot of movie watching of movies that came out before 24, so it's hard for me to think like what came out that year or not. Man, I'm gonna actually back up Megan on the sequel part. I don't know if this counts, but Dune Part 2
It's good too.
That's a movie. That's a movie. And other than that though, I really, really, really liked Nosferatu. I got to see that in the theater right after Christmas.
So what I'm hearing, Cormac, is that you're ruining our whole vibe here by choosing a sequel and a remake.
Yeah, because Nosferatu is technically a remake of something that was made by German Impressionists in the 1920s.
Yeah. It was.
That is a remake.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole drama to the original Nosferatu making. If I remember right, they actually made the name Nosferatu because they're copying the novel, which was supposed to be Dracula. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole drawn out like copyright battle about it in Germany. Mm-hmm. And the Nosferatu film lost that battle, and there's the whole film was supposed to be destroyed. And if I remember right, we found it because we just found a copy like in a warehouse like in New Jersey.
And not for nothing, I would watch a movie about that.
It's kind of cool. Yeah,
I guess we can jump in here and say, I guess what we want to be clear about before we begin all of this is that like there's nothing inherently wrong with making a sequel. Yeah. Nothing inherently wrong with adapting existing intellectual property. I guess to create another example, like this episode is going to air the same week that the new season of Invincible comes out on Amazon Prime. And Cormac and I talk about this series all the time. It's like one of our favorite series. It's so fun, right? It's not only the third season of the show, but the show itself is adapted from comic books, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong with this. But right now it seems like literally almost everything that's being made is a remake or a sequel. I think, Cormac, when we were doing the prep work for this episode, you said that like literally every single one of like the top 20 films or something last year was either a remake or a sequel, right?
It's definitely top 10. I checked this stat, and it's that every single one of the top 10 grossing movies of the last year was a remake or a sequel.
And that's just a little bit nuts to me. And I guess in order to understand why this is, it might be useful for people to understand a little bit more about how film and television production works. Because I think most people do not have a particularly clear idea of how these things function. And I didn't have an idea of how these things function until I went on a studio tour, and like the person who was doing the studio tour like told us about how these production companies work and all of that, right? So maybe, Cormac, could you give us a little bit of sort of background of like how this works, how companies sell to networks, like how the financing process works, all that kind of stuff.
Writing spec, right? Spec writing is basically like, I'm writing something and no one's commissioning me to do it. I'm writing it for me and I'm hoping that someone's going to buy it. Agents and managers hate that. They're like, no. Well, by and large, some are like, we'll just do it, I guess. But usually there's some sort of like wind in the air or some sort of like, hey, we need this sort of movie, or we need a specific like installment to a franchise, write a sequel to kind of deal, right? A writer would go make this. They would have to then pitch it, and then a studio would pick that up. So back in the day, it used to sort of...
How far is back in the day here?
Yeah. Man, basically pre like streaming, I could say, because there's been a bit of like a transitory period where it became like this. So it's hard to say exactly when. But it used to be that studios would basically have, I don't know, like dozens of these projects like in limbo. Like, all right, we'll it got pitched to us. We said yes, they're going to develop it further, and we'll say no to a bunch of them, but eventually we'll say yes to a couple of them. Now it seems that like you'll have, all these projects are getting pitched to studios that have fully like the script's pre-fleshed out. It has talent, directors attached to the project. They've committed. if you're gonna make this movie, I'm gonna work on it. And studios are basically like saying no. They're not developing a bunch at a time. They're basically saying, we're gonna pick you two guys, and you're getting made. There's no like, we'll say no down the line. So a lot less like putting your eggs in one or two baskets, if you will, as opposed to like dozens.
Eggs are in fewer baskets is the general theme.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, for sure. And then, eventually it gets to a point where the script gets greenlit, meaning we're moving all our money, we're going to produce, like actually make it. They shoot it, they edit it, they figure out how to market it.
So generally then, are studios committing earlier in the process to, we will definitely make this project? So that's got to lower the amount of risk that they're willing to take with a project, right? Okay. Or they are then picking less risky projects. Okay.
This is part of my general thesis, call it a tinfoil hat thing or not. My view is that with the new change in leadership, backing up a tiny bit, I don't know if y'all are aware that there's been a bit of movement about like who the new studio heads have been, and it's again been rolling it over time. But a lot of the new heads of these studios are, finance folk, and I think that they carry with them a very different mindset about how to run these businesses and how they see risk. So this is, I think, a reflection of that. Yeah.
And check out our episode on shareholder supremacy for a little bit more on that one.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
What I'm hearing, I guess, let me know if this is like a reasonable interpretation, is that one of the key reasons why we're getting so many sequels and so many remakes is because they know that people are going to go see them, basically, right? Or they assume that people are going to go see them because it's stuff that they have already heard about, I guess you could say, right? Whereas making something that is totally new and might be really good, right? Or adapting some IP that like isn't super well known, right? Like another one of my favorite new things that I saw in 2024 is the Apple TV series Slow Horses, which is based on a book series that I had never heard about prior to watching the show. I think maybe the book series is better known in the United Kingdom, but like that kind of thing isn't getting made very often. And I feel like, if I may say, and maybe Cormac, you have a little bit of insight into this, it feels like Apple is like the only game in town that seems to be making really high quality originals right now. Is there a reason for that? What's behind that, I guess?
Okay, as far as like the different streamers go, and it does help to have deep pockets behind you to kind of make you feel safer, maybe take some more risk theoretically. But in terms of like the concentration of high quality content that they've curated on a platform, Apple is like what HBO used to be, I think.
I think that's a great analogy. Yes,
yeah, they're like absolutely. The new home of like prestige television.
Yeah. Also, I like their UI a lot, and it looks pretty. So that's cool.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, the three of us have fairly different tastes in TV, I think. Or at least I think I diverge from you guys a little bit, because I'm not sure you are super into the Buccaneers, which is another Apple
My wife is super into the Buccaneers.
Oh my God, I love it. It's so great.
The Buccaneers is one of those instances where you're adapting an existing IP, but from like 100 years ago. Yeah.
Yes, in a completely different way, and from 100 years ago. It's very much like the Greta Gerwig Little Women kind of vibe.
Yes.
But for a book that, it's Edith Wharton, it's 100 years old, So
I think one of the key things here is that like all of these things feel so good and so new and so original because it doesn't feel like they are trying to like tug on your nostalgia strings, right? And they don't feel like cash grabs, right? This is another big thing that we talked about sort of in the prep work for this episode, is that like a lot of these just kind of feel like cash grabs, right? Like we were talking about like Moana 2 in particular. We have a Moana 2, fine. But like 2 years from now, they're already readapting the original animated Moana to live action.
Has to do with Dwayne Johnson's age. Like, he's a little worried he's not going to be able to do it in a few years.
Right? Like, it just feels like...
can't come up with a better explanation.
Like, it just, I guess, so bring it back around to a bit of a question here, like something we can actually sink our teeth into, Cormac. Like, what is, in your view, behind why so many movies feel like just naked cash grabs right now?
Ooh, so okay, good question. I can't give you a concrete answer. I can give you my opinion, which is that.
Perfect.
Thank you. Which is basically that my sense is that these movies are getting made because studios, producer heads, whoever the movers and shakers that be that decide the movies that get made, they care about like checking the boxes of a type of movie that would sell and put the, so to speak, asses in seats, more than the movie being good, you know? And they, not that there's not producers and folks that want to make good stuff, where there's chock full of them, right? But at the very top, like, this is the concern. And I have first-hand experience when, you know, I've written coverage on things and I would give any note about, you know, the minutia of the story. Like, hey, like, there's issues with like these parts of the story that I think should be flagged for change. And the amount of times I was basically poo-pooed and told, like, okay, like, it's getting made. You know, we don't care about that. You know, it checks the boxes and whatever, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I think that, you know, they care about, like, once we put your butt in the seat, we made our money.
We don't care if you enjoy it once you've paid to see it.
Well, I mean, like, yeah, that's sort of like the economics of it, you know?
Yeah.
You pay your ticket and then they're like, great, people went to go see it. Did they like it? I don't know. I mean, I think that it would behoove them to make something that, you know, makes more people want to go see it through word of mouth, but ultimately that's the name of the game.
Well, that's a very interesting observation, because I was just thinking, oh, well, why don't they care about word of mouth? I think there's also such an emphasis, and this is not a new phenomenon, but there's such an emphasis on opening weekend that the second weekend matters so much less, and that's where you would realize that word of mouth benefit. Huh.
Yeah.
It also,
sorry.
It seems to me as well, and maybe this is going to relate to what you were about to say, Cormac. A lot to think about, sort of like the original blockbusters, right? Or like the quintessential blockbuster, like Star Wars, right? The first Star Wars movie. It was released in just a few theaters, right? Back in, I think it's 1978, right? Am I getting that year right? I think that's right. Released, we'll say 1977, 1978, right? Released in just a few theaters. Everyone wants to go see this thing. It spreads like wildfire through word of mouth, right? Does not have the kind of like incredible marketing campaign, $100 million marketing campaign that most big movies have nowadays, right? It seems like today there is no real opportunity for movies to become sleeper hits like that, right? Like, they are either going to be marketed with like a multi-million-dollar marketing budget and a bunch of people are going to go see them, or they're this like independent film thing that like gets shown so many times in so many theaters, and they know it's going to have this sort of limited run. And there's no opportunity for movies to break out of either of those categories. This is like maybe one of my more like boomer opinions, like, right? But like, it seems like Hollywood is, broadly speaking, making less interesting, less artistic, less like movies with less to say than they used to. Like, is this just me being nostalgic? Am I an old man yelling at a cloud here? Is this a thing that's like, is this part of the like, let's get your butt in the seat and we don't care if you like it?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm maybe a little bit harsh about, you know, how I come off with the whole, we put the asses in the seats, who gives a shit, right? But I mean, to an extent, that is like how it is, you know. I think that like when you care about like we're gonna make X amount of this type of movie. Like, I remember very recently I was in the theater, I saw like 3 trailers for a movie about like the war in Iraq or something like that, or, you know, and it's like, damn, is this gonna be like, we're gonna get like a fuck ton of Iraq movies now or whatever. You get tired of that. So I think that like okay, I need to back up. There's a lot of things that were said that I want to touch on. Seriously, there were. Please remind me, Megan, what was it that you said right before Clayton jumped in with his point? There's just so many things I want to touch on.
Oh my
I'm
God.
excited to, yeah.
Do I even remember what I said? I don't know that I remember what I said. I think we were talking about how the box office numbers from the first weekend are all that matter.
Yes. Okay.
To the finance guys.
So I can talk about it, and it's not all that matters, but
Mm-hmm.
it matters a lot, and I think now it matters even more. Easily, by far, the most profitable period in a film's lifespan is going to be the box office. You know, when you buy a movie ticket to watch a movie, that is the like percentage profit margin, the best that they're going to get. You know, when it goes to back in the day, it used to be box office, and the opening weekend was the most amount of money over the time, right? Then it drops, it literally tapers off. It almost never goes back up. Like, that's not a thing. Normally, if there's a movie that comes out that's really, really good, they want to time it for like the award season, not just because it's just to win the award, but there's certain hype around the award where they can have an extended release of it. They can keep showing it, and it's not going up. It's more just sort of around. They're still selling some tickets, so they're still making that money. But after that movie would be done in theaters, then it would go to DVD, or I guess they had videotape back then. Then you have your video on demand, once that was a thing. And then, what was the other thing that they would also have? In like cable and stuff like that, you know, where
syndication.
Yeah. And then you would get the advertisements and the TV ad money coming in through that too. And like, so there's all these different like avenues to generate revenue. Now with the advent,
we can really tell that times have changed where the younger members of the panel forgot what cable was.
Yeah. Well, so many things, you know.
I have thoughts. I do want to make sure that we kind of talk a little bit about, you know, quality and storytelling and what it does, because I don't think it's as you're saying, people don't care, or the people who are making decisions don't really care about the quality of all of the films that they make, so long as they're making a certain number that check a certain number of boxes. And no, that's not entirely a new phenomenon. The studio system made a lot of schlock, you know, and we remember, it's kind of like, oh, music in the 80s was so great. It's like, no, you only hear the good stuff now. You don't hear the trash. You hear the good things. The same thing with movies. Like Casablanca was a spin-off of Algiers, which no one has ever heard of. So, you know, there's a lot of bad movies were made then. A lot of bad movies are made now, but it feels as though when you rely on a sequel, you are undermining the stakes of the conflict. You are not investing in character development. I think Gladiator 2 may have been uniquely bad at this, but it was really, really thin on all character development of all sorts, of either the protagonist, antagonist, everybody. And then I think constantly raising the stakes as the films go on means that you wind up writing yourself into kind of a CGI corner a little bit, where you have to use CGI that maybe you're not prepared to do well. And I'm thinking specifically of the gladiator riding a rhinoceros.
Oh, wow.
Gladiator 2.
I haven't seen the movie.
I think that this is also true just of like any series of sequels, right? Like the Fast and Furious movies, I think, are perfect examples of this, right? Like they used to be about street race, and now they're like about people driving cars and saving the world from the.
I didn't see one until Hobbs and Shaw, and I'm like, what is happening here?
I think I also want to talk about and maybe Cormac, we bring you in as the writer on this bit. Cormac, the writer. Put on your writer hat in just a moment.
Do you mind if I jump in real quick just to finish a point I made?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm gonna make 2 points. One is that because there actually was a place I was going with the rundown of how it used to happen.
Yeah.
Was just because those extra revenues of, you know, revenue streams provided ways for studios to kind of like allow more risk. So a lot of movies that got made like back then would not get made now purely on the basis of like it's probably not going to do great in the box office, you know.
So like the cult classic that makes its money back on VHS sales.
That's 100,000%. Yeah,
Okay.
like a lot of movies got made because they're like, we're not gonna do great in the box office, but it's so good that like this has to get made. Like this is a random one that's coming to mind, but Idiocracy is one. Really, Mike Judge's entire career is a little bit like cult classics. But yeah, Idiocracy was one where studios were like, this isn't gonna do well at all. But like, I guess, you know, his other work seems good enough where we're probably think it's gonna be good, and we'll make the money back on DVDs when it comes on DVD. And it did. It became a cult classic. But yeah, on the other note, I just want to say, echoing this isn't my own words. This is something I heard before. But it's really funny how when a franchise goes crazy long, it just goes off the rails, and you have stuff like Pitch Perfect 3, which is like the Cars 2 of the Pitch Perfect universe. You know? It's just randomly a spy movie now. Spoilers. But like, it's, you know, it's like, okay, what is this?
I think one of my favorite examples of that in TV, like when a show goes too long, is like Scandal had a premise originally that was relatable and somewhat grounded in reality.
Okay.
And then it became like the conspiracy all around us.
Yeah.
We're killing Supreme Court justices or something. I don't know. It got really wild. And so if things go too long, like I think the Fast and Furious franchise is probably a great example of that, you trend towards absurdity.
Yeah, you're just like grafting and Frankensteining pieces of a type movie together and be like, oh, we can make this a Fast and Furious sequel, and that'll generate some tickets. We'll just have to change these little, and then it's this monstrosity. No offense to the Fast and Furious lovers. I mean,
and another good example of this, I think, is Riverdale, right? Where like you have this like the first season of Riverdale, I genuinely enjoyed. It's like this whodunit, like crime mystery sort of thing, and then 3 seasons later, there's magic and like Archie is like can't be around palladium, like because it saps his super strength like kryptonite. Like,
I think Riverdale's a psyop. Based
on the comic book that you get at the grocery store.
Yes, it was. Okay, so I think maybe I was being a little bit of an old man yelling at a cloud that, like, we only remember the good stuff from the past, right? But it does seem to me that perhaps, and this is maybe where we'll bring Cormac the writer in, put on your writing hat, right? That either planning for sequels, or indeed not planning for sequels, causes you to really fuck up character arcs. Like, what I think happens here, what I notice a lot is, especially if there isn't like a planned sequel happening, like if it's supposed to be a standalone film and then they make another one in the future because the first one did super well and then they really want to make more money, is like you have this character that goes through this arc, right? Like maybe I think Frozen is a good example of this, where I don't think they planned the sequel, right? You have Elsa and Anna go through this arc. They've completed this character arc of like becoming this confident pair of sisters, right? And then starting with at the very beginning of Frozen 2, which I genuinely quite enjoy, right? But they're right back to square one as being like the not confident sisters. There's conflict between the two of them. Elsa is self-doubting again and doesn't know which way to turn, right? Like you completely fuck up their character arc because you need them to go through another arc in the sequel, right? And so you just have this situation where the characters don't act the way that they should, given what they've already been through. And it just, as Megan said earlier, like totally flattens the stakes of the first film, the first season in a television series, if that makes sense. Am I still an old man yelling at a cloud here, or is this a thing that you've noticed as a writer?
I'm piggybacking a little bit, okay? I'm gonna say that part of the problem is like when you choose to make a sequel, sort of no matter what, when the story's done, you know, it's like, can you like then invent another story to be made that actually is quality? Sure, it's possible. Now, I'm not, privy to all the backroom dealings and planning of what was actually planned and not, but I actually do think I tend to agree. It's a lot harder to then like, you plan for a complete story and then be like, all right, do it again with the same characters. It's like, well, You know, does there?
Hamlet 2. Let's figure this out.
Yeah, right. Romeo and Juliet 2.
This
They're back
time
from
it's
the
personal.
Romeo and Juliet 2. They're back from the dead. It's a zombie movie, and they're
Yes.
zombie lovers.
Zombie Hamlet. Actually.
Yeah. Hey, you told me to put a writer hat on. You know, this is what's going on. You know, and now they have to spread their love to
I would
all
watch
of
Zombie Hamlet. That would be hilarious.
They have to spread their love to all of Rome and like freaking I don't know, zombie apocalypse, and I don't know. There's a zombie romance movie that exists. Warm Bodies, that's what it was.
Yeah, what a weird film.
Anyways, I think that's an excellent point actually. Whether it's without planning or just like you have a completed character arc, it's sort of like, well, now this character that's like learned their lessons, like what's like the new
you have to sort of like lesson they need to learn,
yeah, you have to like invent a new flaw. And I mean, like, in a way that's a little bit like you're starting to get into the territory of like television again, where you have these ongoing stories where they have to be a lot more planned out. You know, when you're pitching a pilot, when you're pitching a show, it's not just the pilot. You have to have a bit of like a story Bible. You have to have an idea of like, here's where this is going. And you also are not alone in the endeavor. Typically you have a writer's room and, you know, minds working at it. So in that sense, like, yeah, there is a lot of careful planning, and that's how TV is managed. And I think that's like when you look to just movie series that are at this point, they're just becoming like movie franchises, because these series these days, the runtimes, you know, we're getting like out like all of them are at least an hour now. It seems like our hour dramas, a little over an hour. We're seriously, again, we're just releasing full film franchises.
Yeah, we're like Stranger Things. The last season of Stranger Things was like hour and 45-minute episodes, right? You're basically releasing like 5 movies, right? Just like
for serious. Yeah.
And it feels to me like this is sort of part of the broader takeaway, the broader trend for me of this is that like there are a lot of headwinds facing the entertainment industry right now, and maybe in order to get through it, they're just trying to make money. But it feels like that has caused a bit of the artistry to go out of at least like popular movie making, mass movie making, movies that are intended to be seen by a lot of people, right? Do you think that these headwinds, these like contract fights, the use of AI, like do they actually relate to the problem of sequels and remakes and all that? Are they part of these same trends? Or am I again just sort of making this up in my tinfoil hat, putting things together brain?
We have a streaming bubble, right? We're making so much stuff, and it took us maybe a little bit too long to realize that the pace of production was just an unprofitable kind of mess that we're bounding towards, and the plug was pulled rather rapidly. And when people point at things like, you know, the Writers Guild and SAG holding out for their contract negotiations as like the cause, this was going to happen regardless. And you know, unions were trying to secure their protections before this happened, because they knew once this happened, it would be really bad. So it's definitely not their fault. I think AI also, on a separate note, is definitely a specter. And I think it definitely adds into the mix of problems about like why production feels so slow. It seems that, again, the movers and the shakers at the top are really trying to position AI to be this thing that is more than just a tool. At least that's maybe my tinfoil hat thing. And a lot of people feel really sketched out by it. I think that ever since we kind of pulled the plug on the bubble, we've had studios just seem to be so risk averse to the point that they straight up seem scared. It's even more than we've ever been. Far less stuff is even getting made than before. And there's a very constant conversation of when is it going to come back? And some people are going, maybe I heard that there's going to be some stuff. And everyone's kind of shrugging their shoulders and, you know, we'll see. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Did I leave off in the middle of that?
It strikes me here that one of the key problems is that we're not setting up a future generation well here for the entertainment industry. If we're just making sequels, if we're just making remakes, if we're relying on people who studios have worked with before, then it becomes a lot more difficult to see where sort of the future artistry is going to come from. And like, I guess for someone like like you in your position, is that what you see? Has it become much harder in recent years to like find sort of actual writing assignments, actual like directing assignments, that kind of thing? Like how has that changed for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, like, the amount of folks that, write and direct is pretty saturated. But I think the biggest problem isn't so much the fact that, like, sequels are kind of thrown around. It's more that there's just so much less stuff getting made. And part of, the ingredients of baking the cake of the situation that we're in is that we're kind of, like, putting less eggs into even less baskets. And we're putting, I'm getting lost in this eggs and baskets analogy. We're putting a lot of money into these few things that we feel like are surefire hits, we being them, the studios, those being the sequels and the franchises and the whatever. Because there's less things to go around, it hurts everyone across the board. There's so many people here that work directly and indirectly in the industry. Yeah, it's even more exacerbated for the writers and directors because, you might have whole grip crews where dozens of people, but there's only like, for the most part, one director on a film, So it's that much more exacerbated, and the effects in that community are felt a lot more in that way. It's not even necessarily like, if the numbers were the same in theoretically, Nightmareland maybe, if everything we were doing were sequels and such, that's not necessarily the worst thing for like new and up and coming like writers and directors. Quite a few instances that I can remember, at least, of, a studio being like, all right, we're going to give this like franchise film to like a newer director because it's a little bit paint by the numbers. Like, we know
how much
we want
could
it
they
to
possibly
be.
screw it up, sort of thing.
We know what we want it to be. A lot more studio involvement and by producer involvement in those films than a lot of people would like to think.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try and avoid saying names, but there is a number of people that have this strategy, but there's one particular, I'm trying to choose my words very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Agent or manager whose main strategy is that they would take a client, being a writer-director, who is known for, maybe being like really indie, very, very new, upcoming, and then they'd be like, all right, I'm going to throw you into in a studio film that's very different than what you were making, with the idea and hope and a prayer maybe that would be successful. They would earn a lot of money. This is careers. We care about that. That's not, it shouldn't be like forgotten.
But it establishes reputation and credibility then, if they're successful.
A little bit. Yeah, if you can do a job, then that, then means a lot more potential money down the line, jobs down the line, etc. So like, the line of thinking is not bad at all, but it's not the worst thing in the world in terms of stuff like that. It's more just the fact that we're so risk averse that we're just not doing anything. That's the real issue. And I think this is like part of, again, maybe part of both the result and also the cause of that, I think, are sticking to the same ideas, the same movies. I mean, now more than ever, another note, now more than ever, there's just more sequels and remakes than ever before. Actually, I remember I was looking at that headline like 2 years ago, and I think it was true in the last year, and I think it's going to be true again this year. Like, it's kind of like a little bit sad. Oh, man.
Climate change of Hollywood.
Ooh.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, on that happy note, I do think it's time for us to take a break.
It is about time for us to take a break. This is right.
We've told you that everything's terrible, but when we come back, we will tell you about how things could be better. So let's take a quick break.
We'll talk about whether or not there is something we can do to fix this. So we'll take a quick break. We'll come right back. All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. We just got done telling you for 40 minutes in a row, basically, about how the movie industry is a little bit fucked in a number of different ways. And this second half of the show is where we would normally present you some evidence-backed, well-researched policy recommendations about what we could do to solve this problem. However, there are not really well-researched, evidence-backed policy solutions here because this is not a thing that people study how to fix. So what we're going to do for the next, little bit of time here is some fun, rampant speculation on our part about what are some things that we could do at a personal and possibly a policy level to help make movies feel a little bit less shitty. So let's go ahead and do that for ourselves. First things first, I think personal level, very clearly to me at least, like go watch original movies and like watch original television. Like they make Marvel movies because everyone goes to watch them, because they make $1 billion, right? Like if you go and see things that they make, they will make more of them. If they think they will make money, they will make more of them.
I do want to ask a question about that because it feels like every 5 or 10 years, studios relearn that women like to go to the movies and watch like female comedies and such. Like Bridesmaids was a revelation for folks. Like, yeah, women like movies too, friends. What are we doing here? And also that men are more willing, I think, than a lot of people give them credit for, to go see a rom-com or something. If a woman in their life says, "Hey, I really want to go see Wicked. Will you go see Wicked with me?" Most dudes say yes. What's the story with that?
This is part of the rampant speculation, maybe, but I think that it's big time. If you build it, they will come, and I think that maybe part of the ideology of current state of affairs is that it's the other way around. They're playing on specific movies to be made because they're trying to predict like audiences want to see X type of movie. Where really, I just think like if you make a movie that's good, like people get excited for that. You don't have to wait always until November and December to release your good movie. Like you just freaking like make it good and put it out there and learn how to freaking sell a movie. Come on, what are we doing here?
And invest a little bit in marketing. I think the only reason that I had heard about the movie Fly Me to the Moon was because I lived right by Sony and they had a big poster on the wall. But that was it. I saw no other marketing. And I watched it the other day and went, this is kind of hilarious and delightful. It's just a random kind of middle of the road movie.
This is also a thing that I think is maybe a little bit particular to living in Los Angeles, which is that like there are so many billboards and so many like bus stop advertisements and like advertisements like wrapping city buses as well, about movies and television shows that are coming out. Like
it is a very LA thing. Yes.
They will like redecorate bus stops with like the characters from a show. Like there's a bus stop, I think it's on La Cienega and Sunset, that is frequently like dolled up basically, and when the Rings of Power season 2 came out, they made it up as like a castle with like orcs and stuff like flying around it. And so I like learn about a lot of things this way, right? Just like seeing these for your consideration advertisements basically that are meant for like 80 members of the Academy who might happen to be driving
the rest of the world does not see that advertising, just like how you don't see the Lockheed Martin ads in the Washington DC Metro anywhere else.
But to this point, this information is out there for people to go and find, right? Like there's nothing hidden about the fact that Fly Me to the Moon was made, right? Like you can actively search out these movies that are being made without them having to be directly marketed to you. And so I think like as we do a sort of personal responsibility thing on this show every so often, acting in this pro-social way, there is a degree to which if they build it and we don't come, then they're just going to like go back to making the same sort of remakes and sequels, right? So if we're asking for original films, right? If we're asking for stuff that isn't this remake and sequels like treadmill, basically, we actually have to like pony the fuck up and go see the things when they get made, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And I guess to this point, Cormac, maybe there's a question to ask you here, which is that a lot of people, I think, more recently have said, "Well, I'm not going to go and wait, pay to see that in the theaters. I'm gonna wait till it comes out on streaming." Is there actually like a big difference in terms of the signal sent to a studio, like based on whether you go see the movie in theaters or whether in its first week of streaming, like the same number of people end up watching it?
As soon as a film is released in theaters, they get to point and say, "Oh, look, the movie's doing so good, you got to go see it. It's in the theaters now, and you got to go see it." So the more people are actually buying those tickets, that's the biggest cut that they're going to get. When it goes to streaming, the math gets a lot more weird, especially considering like who made the movie, who's distributing it, and how like the nature of their distribution agreement. So you have movies that like might get made by Netflix, has a theatrical release, then goes to their streaming platform. Like they didn't have to like sell it to themselves in the same sense that like an outside independent, distributor or production company would have to sell to a streaming service, right? The nature of that agreement looks very different. And also like think the Writers Guild now, because they provided a little bit more transparency in terms of like how these movies are getting paid out through these streaming sites. So especially like, okay, I'll give you an example. Disney movie gets made, makes money in the box office, great. When it goes to their streaming platform, like, are they bringing new people to watch that? Or like if no one ever watches that, are they making less money necessarily? At least on the streaming service, right? Maybe not, but also maybe. But it's just one of those things that's a lot harder to quantify. Are we getting new members because of it? Are there they track who watches what? So it's just like a thing that they think if they watched it, would they have? I'm going down a rabbit hole of like it starts to get really murky.
I see.
But you're illustrating very well how it is very difficult to attribute money made, and I'm air quoting that, from streaming versus a very direct signal of XYZ number of people went to see the movie in theaters. They were there explicitly to see this film, and we know that very clearly. Versus, I think you've illustrated very well, it's very hard to tell if people are getting Disney Plus so they can watch Moana 2 or for some other reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And they still track who watches what. Like if you watch it on streaming, like they're gonna keep track of that, and it is gonna be like a signal or a boost or whatever. But by far the biggest boon is the theater thing. It's just the biggest amount of money.
So I guess with that in mind, I think this is sort of like one of the only real personal things that people can do, right? Like search out these movies, go and watch them, all of that. I suppose like, because this is a policy-focused show, at least a little bit of a policy-focused show, is there a policy angle here? Is, for example, there's something that like states could do that like the government of California specifically could do? Is this something that the big unions could negotiate in a contract, or is this just like us being sort of angry at windmills? Which I guess I should note is a Don Quixote reference for you kids out there. This was a book that was originally published when Megan was just a youth.
Podcasting is not a visual medium, but I look phenomenal for being 500 years old.
One of those youths. Oh my goodness.
So, but like, is there a policy angle here, Cormac? Is there a policy angle that we could maybe pull?
I mean, I can spitball with the caveat of like I am not a policy person. I don't write policy. However, there's examples of content restriction and mandates outside of America. So, for example, we have in France, I know they have laws that actually limit or maintain like a minimum like for how many screens or how much screen time that gets shown for domestic movies versus non-domestic movies, right? And that would translate to like original versus franchise, because Hollywood is like the source of a lot of the franchise stuff, right?
It's not like the domestic French film industry is making like they're making some sequels, making some remakes, but a lot of the stuff that they're making in French cinema is more original stories, original storytelling.
Yeah, they're not making Le Haine 2, or whatever. Like they're just like they're doing their thing. And this is the case for like a lot of countries, I think, like in Europe, that have like a pretty strong like film commission, is that they'll have some policy like that to try and like really bolster their domestic film industry for their economic and political cultural reasons.
Yeah, because we lose track of the fact that our film industry in the US or any country's film industry is a form of soft power, to make this a more political conversation, as is generally the theme of this podcast. Being able to export our culture in terms of exporting US films internationally is a way that we can signal the benefits of our values, etc. And so there is a good reason for taxpayers to be interested in this, which gets us to like film subsidies, right?
And I also think, just before we jump in on film subsidies and like tax credits and stuff, because those are used all over the place, like there is a sense in which like just funding the arts for the arts' sake should be the province of governments a little bit, right? Like,
Yeah.
as we were talking about that, we were talking about this during the break, like the Medicis who like ran Florence, right? Like the family that ran Florence for a while, basically funded the whole fucking Renaissance, right? They funded a lot of the works of art that like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and like
Sandra Botticelli lived
right?
with them, I think.
Right, like
know.
they great guy to have a game named after you, right?
Mhm.
So like it used to be that like it is still the case, right? In many cases that like there are bits of the government that fund arts, that fund the arts, right? And I think a good example of this maybe being used for evil, at least right now, is like the United States military will like let you use a bunch of their shit for free in order to like make your movie more realistic, right? As long as you like give them some sign off and like allow them to, you know, do a little bit of like military industrial complex propaganda, right? But like there's no reason why we shouldn't have that kind of policy exist for making good original movies, right? Like making like not for propaganda purposes, right? But like just for funding the arts for the art's sake. And I think this is maybe a place where we could use these like film credits, tax credits that exist in lots of parts of the world. So maybe like Cormac, what is that all about? What are these tax credits and things? What do they do?
Rather than having to wait for like you to make your nut from the previous film again, you know, or maybe like you're kind of like right on the edge and it kind of provides maybe a little extra blanket of security. When I find myself in these rooms with all the producer types, this is like one of the main things that they bemoan or point to as far as like this is going to determine a lot of production or lack thereof is the interest rates. If the interest rates are going to go lower, then you'll see things come back a lot more. There's going to be a lot more work now. But because they're a little higher, they're kind of holding off, waiting for that to stop. It's a lot of like, you know, I know we're back into solutions time, but part of, you know, the troubles of the film industry is that there's a lot of fear, a lot of waiting for a lot of different reasons. But that's like if you ask those types, that's what I hear those folks say a lot more. It's also something that gets politicized a lot, I notice. Even like Florida, for example, where it's state where I'm from, is I remember being like a ballot thing where like, oh, we're going to bring back tax credits or something for films. We're going to make some movies and TV shows down here. And there's a lot of like rhetoric on the right side of the aisle saying like, oh, those Hollywood pedophiles or whatever, I don't want that left garbage in our state, get them out. You know, we don't want to look at what's happened to Texas. You know, the lefties are coming and mucking things up. You know, it's being politicized in a weird way. I just think it's you know, it should be from their perspective, just like more business, more jobs. So
it does seem like it's just a very basic, like if you're spending less money in order to make these things, then like you can help make more risky quote unquote like original films easier to make, because like you're requiring them to take on less risk in the first. Like it seems like it should almost be like a basic accounting identity here. Like it's like a basic math thing, right? And it feels weird that it gets politicized in that way, if that's the case. Like, well, just get over yourselves maybe a little bit.
I think in addition to just the idea that we're all a little baffled by conservatives not wanting to fund more business in their state, the culture war issue, I think, is what the folks that you're invoking here are pointing to, that it's all these liberal folks. It makes it easier for conservative small studios to make films as well. You know, I think it's very interesting. I don't know why or what exactly happened, but I think Amazon got a contract to distribute a lot of Christian films recently, and they've been showing up on Amazon Prime. And you watch them, and they're like, okay, they're not good from a quality standpoint in terms of the stakes of the story are low because you know that the moral thing is what's going to happen. Also, spoiler alert for the Old Testament, I guess. These stories have been out for thousands of years. We know what's going to happen. The stakes aren't super high in the story of Queen Esther. I know what's going to happen. But you can make those films, but they're typically fairly low budget films If you are a conservative culture person, wouldn't you want to put more of that out into the world? Wouldn't you want to use this same engine of, quite frankly, propaganda? Film has been used for propaganda as long as films existed. Why wouldn't you want to use that? So these folks are wrong for reasons other than the ones that we think, as well as the reasons that we think.
It just seems to me that there's an opportunity here. Like, there's a possibility here that you could use the apparatus of the state, and like maybe this is us just sort of like, for lack of better terms, liberal left, like government intervention stuff talking, right? Like maybe there's a little bit of that going on.
It's industrial policy, but for Hollywood. Let's be honest.
Like it feels like there is an opportunity to be a little bit more like, let's actually produce a little bit of real quote unquote culture again, right? That's like not quite so heavily commercialized, not quite so heavily consumerist, not so based on how many people can we get into the seats to see this movie, right? How many hours of streaming can we get like on this during its first week of release on Netflix, right? But because of the headwinds the entertainment industry is facing, you know, various reasons that we talked about earlier, right? We don't need to get back into. It might need a little bit of, at least right now, actual intervention to help defray some of those costs. And it feels like it doesn't feel beyond the pale for me for us to suggest that we could talk about.
The view has been murkied in terms of like what is good for like the overall health of in future of the industry. There's sort of like a, how do I put this, like a missing value or a hidden value there to it, where we hear about these studies where like there's audiences are getting fatigued of seeing all these sequels, right?
So it's not just us being annoyed.
Oh,
Other
no.
audiences are annoyed.
You're not alone on this, okay? That said, it's sort of like, okay, I'm going to make a sports analogy. It's really hard, really hard to quantify the value of good defense, right? Like there's certain ways in certain positions and certain sports, like you can sort of figure that out. But like in soccer, for example, if someone's really good at defense, like they're not really making tackles, you know? So if you see a defender making a lot of tackles, it's because they're being attacked a lot more. But like if someone's a really good defender, they'll try and avoid them. So a lot of their defensive stats are just like 0. And that's
so
like,
you're trying to
good.
quantify something that isn't happening.
Sort of. So what I'm saying is like, okay, if we're making a lot more of these sequels, like it's hard to quantify the harm that's happening. It's sort of like, you know, when you're eating like a lot of unhealthy food, like maybe your arteries are getting clogged like little by little by little. And it's sort of hard to figure it out until you like really go and look at all the veins. I think that like, although I do think that that's happening, and I think that also what would even be less risky for studios is to go back to a little bit what we were doing before, which is we have our eggs in a lot of fucking baskets. I just think that it would behoove studios because all these successful franchises started off as an original idea, an original film. And if they're looking for like what the next franchise is going to be, or like all these franchises people are getting tired of, it's time for a new one. Throw some stuff at the wall. Let's make some stuff, you know? Just food for thought.
Toy Story was an incredibly original idea when it first came out. And I mean, they've made a bunch, but that was a brand new idea when it first was made.
And it strikes me that oftentimes when you make a good original film, it does well. Like, it might not make $1 billion, right? But you made it for $15 million and it made a $75 million at the box office, right? Like, it's not going to be the thing that like tides your studio over to the next year, but there's no reason for you not to make it, right? Like if you have more of the ability to take on these quote unquote riskier projects. To your point, Cormac, like at a certain point, maybe we should just go out and make some stuff, right? And see what sticks, right? See what sticks. It's the sort of essence of like what maybe movie making and art generally should be, right? Like not everything has to be a masterpiece. You just gotta actually you gotta make some films. You gotta paint some paintings, right? Like, not everything you do is gonna be a winner.
Yes,
but some of them are, and you shouldn't let the fact that not every single one will be successful dissuade you from making them at all.
Also, in defense of not winners, not every movie that I really enjoy is the best movie ever made.
And that's okay.
I, in fact, am not a huge fan of Citizen Kane. Like, I'm not
That's
sitting
fine.
around watching it for fun on a Friday night.
That's fine.
I'm watching Twisters 2 again. So they don't all have to be the greatest quality, most original films ever. You can have a fairly paint-by-numbers rom-com that I am going to enjoy because it's a genre that I like. It's a little bit different. It's, made with a couple of leads who have good chemistry. That's not going to win any awards. We could probably do a whole different episode on the return of the B movie, but we really can have a whole bunch of movies for everyone, accepting their own kind of niche. I think that maybe that's what studios need to be aiming for is, maybe that's not going to be the number one box office film that year, but it's going to be different, interesting, and draw a new audience that doesn't drive movie going for the most part.
Yeah. If any studio heads happen to be listening to this podcast, stop being cowards and make some movies, goddammit. All right, I think this is probably a good place for us to call it. I think we've covered sort of everything we might be able to cover here. Get to making some movies out there, people. Get to making some movies.
Absolutely.
And until we see them in our theaters, until we see them in front of our faces as we sit, as Nicole Kidman would say, when the lights begin to dim and we're transported someplace magical. Until then, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
I was once Cormac Schambach.
And we will see you guys next time.